I'm Ben Rich. I'm Chief Executive of Radix Big Tent. Our mission, for those who don't know us, is concerned with system renewal. And with every respect to our other ongoing projects on housing and reform of the investment system, nowhere, I think, is system renewal more necessary than in the case of democracy. Radix Big Tent is a registered charity, for those that don't know us. We're cross-party, non-partisan. Our board includes Conservatives, Labour and Lib Dem parliamentarians, as well as business people, academics and journalists. And for full disclosure, which feels appropriate in this case, we are funded by a mixture of individuals, charitable foundations and commercial organisations, but we are entirely editorially independent. And if you want to find out more about our funders, you can see that on our website. In line with Radix Brief, to be a platform for those outside the Westminster bubble, I will make certain that we spend at least half of our time responding to the questions and discussions that appear in the chat. And many of you have already submitted questions in advance, for which much thanks, and we'll post those up to begin with. I'll do my best to get through as many of those questions as possible while abusing my position as chair to probe and pose a few of my own. Please do feel free to post questions as we go, as well as comments, and use the reaction buttons, if you know how to do that, to let me know what you think of what the panelists are saying and to steer the conversation. So my briefing notes now say I'm to introduce the chair, but that's me on this rare occasion. So I shall instead introduce our three speakers. Just with a reminder of, for those who are joining us late, if you don't mind pausing your videos to maximize the bandwidth for the conversation. So over the last year, Radix Big Tent has published a couple of publications on democratic renewal, Can Parliament Take Back Control and the Threat to Democracy. And in both cases, they are written in whole or in part by Paul Tyler, by Lord Tyler, who will be one of our speakers today. Lord Tyler was Liberal MP for Bodmin in 1974, Liberal Democrat MP for North Cornwall from 92 to 2005, and a working peer till 2021, and has worked on quite a number of cross-party reform initiatives. So good to have you back, Paul. Caroline Slocock is the Director of Civil Exchange, which aims to improve the way government works with civil society, a former civil servant and was private secretary both to Margaret Thatcher and John Major, and a regular commentator in the media. And it's good to have you, Caroline. And I'm going to start with the author of the white paper on democratic integrity, which is sort of providing the excuse for our discussion tonight. Tom Brake was an MP for 20 years, former deputy leader of the House of Commons in the coalition government, and the director of Unlock Democracy, which campaigns for reforms in the UK, including proportional representation, House of Lords reform. And I'm going to come straight to you, Tom. What is the Democratic Integrity White Paper, and why have you produced it?
Well, thank you, Ben. Thank you very much for hosting this event, and for those who are attending, and indeed Paul Tyler and Caroline Slocock. So what is the Democratic Integrity White Paper? Well, I'm sure many people on this call will be aware that in the last few years, there has been a degree of democratic backsliding in the UK that has been documented by a number of international organisations. We have historic levels or low levels of trust in politicians. And what this triggered was a number of contributors, so including Lord Tyler and Nick Harvey, but also the IPPR, the Institute for Government, the Constitution Unit, and indeed Dominic Grieve and Unlock Democracy. Many of these organisations have documented proposals, recommendations of ways in which we could address these concerns or address some of this democratic backsliding. And with the Democratic Integrity White Paper, what Unlock Democracy has tried to do is to pull these proposals together into one document and to present the recommendations in a way which is hopefully accessible, not just to those who like the Institute for Government, but also uh, accessible generally, so that people can look at the proposals and make suggestions, either about things that they think shouldn't have been included, or things that they think are missing, or things that are could be improved on. So that is the purpose of the Democratic Integrity White Paper. And I would just like to acknowledge again that many of the recommendations have been merrily plagiarized from the organisations that I've referred to before, who share in effect in the production of this white paper.
So Tom, what are you hoping is going to happen as a result of this paper? What do you want to happen next? And just in case there's something you can do about it, from time to time you're slightly muffled.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I can do about that, but I will try to. I'll come closer to the microphone and speak as clearly as I can. What what do I hope will happen as a result of this paper? Well, first of all, we want people on this call to contribute. So the white paper, I think, will either be put into the chat or will be circulated to the people who've attended this event afterwards, so people can read it at their leisure. But obviously, we also want this to be taken up by government, because restoring trust in politics is an emergency. We've heard of two emergencies that are taking place tonight, one in relation to plumbing and one in relation to electrics. But restoring trust in politics is an equally important emergency. And we are obviously circulating this document to relevant government ministers. And for instance, the Modernisation Committee, which is looking at how to improve standards in Parliament or in the House of Commons, we will be using these sections of the Democratic Integrity White Paper as a submission to that particular committee.
Fantastic, thank you. So, Caroline, I mean, the idea of integrity in politics sounds to a lot of people like vegetarian food and McDonald's. Why does this matter to you, and what is it that's actually concerns you based on your many years of experience in politics?
Well, I mean, I think it's essential to democracy and it's essential to good government. And we've seen events in recent years, issues around Partygate, lack of accountability to Parliament, which have really, I think, brought into the spotlight the need for greater action. And just to sort of, say a little bit more about that, I think trust is essential to democracy. And if people don't trust politicians, then they stop voting. And 60% was the turnout at the last election, the lowest since 2001. But that means that 40% of people don't even think it's worth voting in this country. And if you look at the system, you look at people's view of the system, a large number of people, especially from lower socioeconomic groups, just think that democracy doesn't work for them. It's not meeting their needs. And if that happens, then we start to gravitate to extremes. And we're seeing that actually. So I think we're on the road to populism, and we're seeing it in Europe too. But I also think it's essential to good government, because you can't, if government, as government's done today, you stand up, you say some targets, but you can't make those targets actually work. You can't make them happen unless you work with people. You start with Whitehall, you work through with public bodies, the unions. There has to be trust to make that work. And I think that we also need to see more partnerships between government and others, civil society, charities I'm particularly interested in, and business and others. And you can't forge those partnerships if there isn't that critical ingredient of trust. And I think that lack of integrity leads to loss of accountability through parliamentary processes. The lies to Parliament around Partygate are an example of that, but also, the lies to the public and the media. Only this morning, I heard the Shadow Home Secretary say as they've said many times before, that crime is falling, but that actually they've been taken to task by the Statistics Authority because actually they're just excluding a whole category of crime, fraud. It's essentially a lie. But if people tell lies to Parliament, to the media, and to the public, then it's difficult to actually hold people to account. You end up with what Barack Obama called truth decay. And if you can't, differentiate between the truth and facts, you can't, everything starts to fall apart. And just, you asked me why am I particularly seized by this? I mean, I'm, quite old. I worked as a civil servant, not a political supporter for Margaret Thatcher and John Major. But I can tell you that they had much higher standards. They had much more respect for democratic institutions and much higher standards, for example, in making sure that they told the truth to the House. Those standards have fallen. I think corruption as well, we've seen. So I think well done to Unlock Democracy for producing this white paper and looking at the whole thing, because we can't rely on what Peter Hennessy calls the good chaps theory of government, which is just sort of, assuming that everybody's a good person who will do the right thing. So we need to strengthen the system.
So let me come to you, Paul. You've been in and around Parliament for best part of 50 years. Within the first couple of years of your first stint in Parliament, your leader was being prosecuted for attempted murder. So do you think that anything's actually changed?
Yes, I think it has. And I just want to take what Caroline was saying about trust a step further. I mean, it's not only true that 60% was the turnout, but on top of that, 6 million, nearly 7 million people are not registered. The lack of trust in our representative democracy is really serious because, of course, it undermines the whole way in which people are respecting the way we're governed. Everything that goes on in this country is affected by the government. And that if that government can't claim to have the confidence of the majority of the country, then our system is beginning to fall apart. And we have a lack of transparency, of accountability, of trust, which is very serious, which Caroline has referred to. And that's why I was delighted that Tom was able to produce this white paper, because he's brought together a whole number of areas where we should be able to give people better confidence in the transparency of our systems, so its accountability. Unless that does happen quite quickly, then I think we could find in a relatively short time in this Parliament that we are just descending to the sort of levels of Trumpian disaster that the Americans seem to have got themselves into, and far be it from let us go that way. Okay, I've seen some interesting times, but I concur entirely with what Caroline is saying. I think in recent years, the situation has deteriorated. And I think that what Tom is suggesting in this white paper addresses those particular problems that we've got as of now.
So there's loads of stuff in Tom's paper, just as there was in your book, which published at the end of last year. Lifetime of political campaigning in these issues. Where are you going to start? Where are you going to get your teeth into this?
Money. When I was a journalist before politics, I worked with a serious journalist, an investigative journalist, and he always said, follow the money. You know, there's a very important section in the white paper which addresses this. And this particular week, as you'll know, the media and indeed the House of Lords this afternoon, which also indeed referred to Tom's white paper in the brief debate this afternoon, the issue of whether foreign money is now a major threat to the way in which we operate here. Whether it's Russian or whether it's American billionaires, it is now possible to buy an election in this country, seat by seat or party by party. And if you look in the white paper to what Tom has got there, for example, on unincorporated associations, it is incredibly lapse. It is incredibly intransparent, if that is such a word. It's very difficult to see how anybody's going to control what money is going to come in from a foreign source. That was referred to by the Minister in the House of Lords this afternoon. I hope they're going to take this seriously.
So you start with money. Caroline, where would you start?
It's a very rich field, I have to say. But I think I would start with strengthening the rules on integrity for ministers and parliamentarians. And I think that the government has already said that it's going to introduce a new ethics and integrity commission, and most importantly, that will be independently led. So I'd like to see that coming forward with a statutory ministerial code, business appointments, the advisory committee with much sharper teeth, and much better enforcement. And I'd also like to see them looking at gifts. But I think the other big thing that I would want, apart from the money, which I do agree with Paul very much on that, I would like to highlight accountability to Parliament, because I think a lot of people just don't understand how almost by stealth the last government reduced parliamentary accountability. For example, through bringing in skeleton bills, no longer going through the sort of processes which I remember well as a civil servant of green papers and white papers and draft bills, so that people across the country could be consulted on legislation, but using regulations, abusing regulations, which almost have no parliamentary scrutiny of any sort of meaningful kind, and introducing what are known as Henry VIII powers, which are basically laws which allow the government to change the laws through regulations with this very limited and scrutiny. And a really good example of that is the Liberty case, as I call it, where the government took, through Parliament, legislation around protest laws, and were unable to get something through. The Lords overturned it. So they used a regulation to actually overturn the view of the House of Lords. So they defined serious disruption as more than minor, which with big consequences potentially for freedom of speech or freedom of peaceful protest in this country. So I'd like to see prohibition of Henry VIII clauses, and making sure that regulation powers are not abused and cannot be used for fundamental rights and freedoms.
And Tom, I should complete the set. Where are you going to start? And you're welcome to agree with Caroline or Paul with money or with parliamentary accountability, or to choose a third. Well, we've lost your sound altogether, Tom.
There are certain areas where the government have indicated they're going to make change. And therefore, I think that's perhaps less of a priority. And that is, for instance, in relation to MPs' second jobs, where there's already been some movement, not enough in my view, but there has been some movement. In relation to the ministerial code, which Caroline referred to, at the moment, I am hoping that the sorts of problems that occurred under the previous government are less likely to occur under the current government. Now, I may be fooling myself, but I'm hoping that's going to be the case, and therefore, perhaps that is not such a great priority.
You are very dependent, Tom, on those still on them being good chaps.
Indeed, I'm not saying it doesn't need to be addressed. I'm saying that in terms of some immediate priorities for us, I think that the issue that Paul flagged in terms of foreign funding is very definitely a priority. We have a situation in the UK where a foreign donor can, through a shell company, a UK shell company, donate as much as they want to a political party, because the rules are you either have to be on the register as a voter, or you have to be a UK registered company. So I think that's a very obvious door that needs to be slammed shut. And even the issue of someone being on the electoral register is not in itself a guarantee that the person who's on the electoral register is someone who you would want to be donating money to a political party, because that money could actually come from crime, for instance. And all the political parties have to do is to confirm that the person who has donated it is on the register. Paul referred to unincorporated associations, again, which is a means whereby money which is almost untraceable and which nobody, not including the Electoral Commission, have the power to go and look at. So those are definitely areas where we need to take action. And I suppose the last thing that I would certainly support as a priority, which again Paul referred to, is the 6 or 7 million people in the UK who are not on the electoral register, because it's very clear that the people who are most disengaged from the political process, whom the political parties will, it's very unlikely the political parties will be contacting them directly, because the way political parties work is they work off the electoral register. By definition, those people are not on it. And they also tend to speak only to people who actually vote in elections, who are on the electoral register. So actually getting everyone on the register so political parties have to have a conversation, or are more likely to have a conversation, I think is one of the ways that we can try to address, I think, populism, which to a great extent is driven by people being completely disengaged from the political process.
So I'm going to come to the start coming to the questions from the audience in just a minute, but I just wanted to sort of follow that up, because if your theory is that, you know, we may see less of some of these problems, it does strike me that the Labour Party have got manifesto commitments in some of these areas that, you know, with the threat of Elon Musk funding one political party to, you know, the extent of more than was spent on the entire general election last time round, I find myself asking why these good chaps aren't just getting on with dealing with some of those financial issues. And it'd be very interesting to hear, both from a sort of political point of view and from a civil service point of view, you know, what's the obstacle? What's stopping the government dealing with any of this? And Paul, I'm going to throw that at you first.
Well, I think there's lethargy. Frankly, I don't think until there's something very serious comes along, much happens in British politics. I mean, after all, the CSPL, the Committee on Standards in Public Life, was only set up because there was too many scandals going on, and John Major thought it was about time to do something about it. And good, you know, he's done a very good job then, and actually kept an eye on it ever since, very constructively. So it may be that Mr. Musk is going to do us all a favour by mistake, by drawing attention to the total inadequacy of our boundaries in this respect. It's an irony, I think, that he wants to invest in, apparently, in a party that believes in British sovereignty. The idea of British sovereignty being supported by a South African immigrant to the United States who happens to be a billionaire is sort of curious to my mind. But that's how things happen in this country. Sometimes it has to be some extraordinary incident that gets people to take ththings seriously.
Okay, so you think this is the sort of thing that might motivate them? Caroline, what were the obstacles you saw? Because it's not as if the major governments and the Thatcher governments were entirely free of integrity issues.
No, and obviously they had big donations, and those people who donated had big influence. I mean, the biggest obstacle is the money. You know, I mean, if you look at the proposals from the Committee on Standards in Public Life was to cap donations at £10,000, and they made that proposal twice, and twice it's been ignored. IPPR are suggesting a cap at 100,000. But just look at the figures. Frank Hester gave the Conservative Party 20 million. David Sainsbury gave the Labour Party 2.5 million. So, you know, it's quite, you can see how they can slip back into thinking, well, it's not so important. And I think that's why the independent committee on ethics and integrity, which will be, you know, independently led, will be important, because potentially that's got more power to kind of give tougher advice and more public advice to, you know, to the government on these issues and put some pressure on them, because the Committee on Standards and Public Life, it's quite a shadowy body, and it has good recommendations, but it's routinely ignored.
So look, let's begin to pick up some of these questions. And it seems to me that the obvious place to go first is John Newman, who says, given the size of the government's majority in the House of Commons, how can electoral reform be promoted? So he's sort of asking the same question. How are we actually going to make something happen? But in his case, he's interested in electoral reform. Tom, is there a unlock democracy strategy?
Well, probably many of the people on this call will have noticed that a couple of days ago there was a vote in Parliament where, for the first time ever in the House of Commons, members of Parliament voted for electoral reform and proportional representation. Now that vote was symbolic. It wasn't, unfortunately, a bill that the government are required to act on, but it is, I think, important that Parliament has registered its support. And what this does is it gives momentum to an initiative set up by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Fair Elections, which is pushing the government to adopt or to establish a national commission to look at electoral reform. And obviously their case is now much stronger, there having been a vote in Parliament that demonstrates that in this particular vote, there was a majority of MPs who were in favour of electoral reform. So I think, notwithstanding the size of the government majority, we believe that there are now more MPs in Parliament who support PR than there have ever been. We have the Liberal Democrats, the Green Party, a number of the other smaller parties, and the Labour Party membership, and 2/3 of the trade union movement in favour of electoral reform. And that sort of momentum, that sort of pressure will build up on the government. And obviously, we want them to respond positively to the request for a national commission, which would involve the public in determining what electoral reform should take place in this country, one of the very few countries in the world, apart from the US and Belarus, that relies on first past the post for its voting system.
So I don't want tonight to be taken up entirely by electoral reform, which I have no doubt, looking at some of the questions coming in, we could do. But I do want to pick up at least one aspect of this, which is Martin Rayner's question, and this is for you, Caroline. You talk, he says, it wasn't written, it was written before you referred to you, Caroline, but you did in your comment talk about Parliament keeping government democratic. How do you make Parliament democratic and answerable to the people of this country? Are the two things connected for you, or are they things you can deal with separately? Oh, Caroline, we're not hearing you.
Sorry. Well, there's obviously the issue of proportional representation, and which I think I've come round to proportional representation because I think it brings in more voices, and I think that that's a healthy thing. I think it's important to look at the representation of parliamentarians, and I welcome what the Labour Party did to make sure that it had better representation of women. But there's still sort of quite a big way to go on ethnic minority representation, for example. So I think those are important things. But I also think that there's scope for Parliament to be informed by things like citizens' assemblies, which bring in, different voices to look in depth at issues, maybe to advise select committees, as well as to government, ideally. So I think, we need to get more voices heard in this country, and a greater diversity amongst parliamentarians. I think what we are seeing is the latest intake we're seeing, and certainly in the Labour Party, people with more diverse backgrounds than we've seen before. So that's a good thing.
So, I mean, that's interesting, and let's move on to that with you, Paul, if I may. Is whether actually it isn't just all about electoral reform, whether there is more that we can do within our current system. And, perhaps I'll just pull out Alicia Hull's comment, when our representative democracy has failed us so badly, isn't it the duty of citizens to develop an economy and participatory system of government which fits the unstable conditions we now have? Is that too big a job for a party? Isn't it time for a national government on a war footing? Or John Cummings, who also says, marching through the streets of London as a protest is singularly inefficient and ineffective. What sorts of consultation procedures, which may or may not take us back to citizens' assemblies, could we build in to ensure campaign voices are actually heard and responded to by government? So, if not this government, this system, how else, Paul?
Well, I entirely agree about citizens' assemblies, and Caroline's absolutely right. Been very successful elsewhere. They're Irish, of course. And we had one in this country which was largely ignored, even though it was sponsored by 7 select committees on climate change, I think, which was extremely effective. It's a way of having a dialogue, two-way, real dialogue between representatives and a wider community. But the other thing I would also say, we've got extraordinarily centralized in this country. And I don't think devolution has really now had the benefits that we thought it was going to have. I've always believed that decisions should be taken as close as possible that people are going to affect, right the way through from parish councils right up to Parliament. And for example, I think we've got now some proposals coming out in the next few weeks before Christmas, I think, on a local government in England. And I hope it's going to be really a good conversation about how to do that better. I don't think we've got the answers right there. Incidentally, on PI, just for a quick moment, I don't want to go back there too far, but of course we do have very effective systems of representation in Scotland and coming along in Wales and already in Northern Ireland at the local level. And there are many, many more satisfied voters who actually have an impact on the result of an election as a result of that in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, and I hope we'll have in Wales, because they have direct effect on the outcome, 95% if they use all the options there are in STV, for example. So I think it's a mixture. I don't think it's entirely a question of making the House of Commons more effective or more representative, or even making it more able to hold central government to account. I think we've also got to look at the way in which central local communities interact.
Tom, does your democratic integrity paper foresee other models, whether in addition or instead of the current way that we govern ourselves? Oh, you're on mute again.
Oh dear. Not only does the paper do that, but we have also produced a separate paper called Power to the People, which sets out in some detail what devolution, which Lord Tyler's just referred to, should look like. And I think the worry about the devolution white paper that the governments are going to be publishing, we think, in the next couple of weeks before Christmas, is that devolution so far, the emphasis has been very much on devolution is a means of delivering economic growth. I don't have any problem with using devolution to deliver economic growth, but devolution is also about citizens being much closer to decisions, being able to participate in those decisions. And I think that aspect of devolution is at risk of being neglected. And the evidence so far, for instance, of ministers saying if authorities want to secure certain powers, they have got to have a mayor. It is rather counter to devolution. And an announcement a couple of days ago that all the district councils, I think in Norfolk and Suffolk, were going to be disbanded, again, is rather counter to devolution. We already have in the UK a very heavily centralised system with the largest local authorities out of, I think, virtually any single developed country in the world. and getting rid of all the district councils in Norfolk and Suffolk is moving things completely in the wrong direction. Just to come back briefly to the white paper, people will recall that phrase during the Brexit referendum of Parliament taking back control. Well, Parliament in recent years hasn't really taken back control. What has happened is the executive has taken even more control of Parliament, and Caroline has referred to some of the, the Henry VIII clauses in bills, the fact that nowadays often it's bills are skeleton bills where not very much information is provided, and the rest of it is going to come in secondary legislation, so that a lot of the debates really don't take place. We think that there need to be sort of guardrails and safeguards in place to stop that sort of thing happening, and that's in the white paper. And also something which I confess I was, when I was a minister, was partly responsible for, well, perhaps not blocking, but for not allowing it to proceed. And I suspect Paul Tyler knows what I'm about to talk about. And that is the idea of a House Business Committee, so that rather than the government deciding what is going to be debated in Parliament, in fact, it should be Parliament that decides that. I mean, obviously, with certain guarantees about allowing the government to get critical business through, but with Parliament having a much greater degree of control over what debates take place when, so we don't have a scenario which we have historically, where if a debate that Parliament would like to have, but is inconvenient for the government to have it at this time, the government doesn't find time for that debate to take place. So I think a House Business Committee would help to put Parliament back in control of what happens in Parliament rather than the government.
So, with apologies to the person who made exactly this point, I'm afraid I can't find your question just at the moment, but I'll ask it anyway. It's all very well for people in opposition to make these points. Somehow, when they're in government, they seem to forget that. So, sorry, Tom, to put you on the spot. You were in government. The idea was put to you, and why did you end up getting blocked? The idea of giving the House rather than the government permission, and how do more relevantly, because I don't want to embarrass you, but more relevantly, how do we avoid that happening just every time?
Well, it's a good point. And I suppose the answer is that governments don't want to lose control of what happens in Parliament. And so something which your questioner has identified the problem, that things that opposition parties advocate in opposition suddenly are less attractive to implement when they are in government. But I mean, how could we try to ensure that happens? I suppose, for instance, we have a new Parliament with lots of new members of Parliament who perhaps are at the moment slightly less tied into the whips, for instance, who are arriving new, who haven't experienced Parliament as it's been in recent decades, and might be open to some reforms. And we know that there's a group of new MPs, cross-party MPs, who are looking at the procedures of the House and questioning, why is it that we do this weird thing of standing around in a division lobby for 15 minutes? And maybe a cross-party group of new MPs can actually get some of these reforms through, because I suspect there will be, unfortunately, for the large number of Labour MPs, those who are not in government, I suspect some of them are going to be quite frustrated at the lack of ability that they have to influence the government's agenda.
So you've certainly got the problem of those with power not being very good at giving it up. And then we've got Adrian Phillips' comment, which is, why is none of this a priority for our politicians? Because, retail politics and immigration is all they seem to talk about. Paul, do you have a solution that you want to offer Adrian, or should we, I'm wondering whether we should all just go home.
Well, I don't think we should go home, because I think then we end up in Georgia or South Korea or wherever, because I think our system is not that robust that we can just give up on it. But just, I have a
To
thought.
be fair to the South Koreans, they didn't go home.
Well, exactly. That's what I'm saying. Thank goodness. And hopefully the Georgians are going to win too. But I think Caroline may be able to advise us whether the story is true that when I think the then chief whip, I think it was Mr. Pym, said to Margaret Thatcher, we're going to have a big majority, in that wonderful word to that effect. She said, oh, that isn't a good idea at all, because there'll be far too many MPs who think that they're not going to ever be ministers, who won't be kept in line. I'm paraphrasing, and a big majority is not so helpful to a government. Caroline, maybe tell us whether that was right or wrong. But in the meantime, I think that Mr. Starmer has a problem, because, as was evident with that vote on electoral reform, the actual membership of the Labour Party and the wider support from the Labour Party in the unions is not unanimous about anything very much. And therefore, this Parliament may turn out to be a much more interesting one than ones that we've seen more recently, where there has been a degree of discipline from the whips, which has been very remarkable. And it's much easier to keep people in line, of course, if the Prime Minister of the day can say, look, we've got a very small majority and there's a general election coming up. And by the way, I'm the one who decides when to blow the whistle on the end of this game. Even though I'm a party leader, as the Prime Minister can say, I'm the one who decides when Parliament is going to be dissolved, which is itself a ludicrous situation in a parliamentary democracy. That power is very considerable if there's a small majority. With a big one, much less easy to control Parliament.
So, Caroline, does that story ring true to you?
Possibly. I really don't know about whether it's true or not. I mean, I would reflect that actually the MPs did turn against Margaret Thatcher. Obviously, it started with Geoffrey Howe and her ministers, but they voted her out, her own MPs, partly because she wasn't actually really communicating with them, and she was getting horribly out of touch with with their own party and obviously the country. When you think about the poll tax and the riots and that's what did it for her. I mean, I would say that it's important for governments to do things quickly. They're going to do these because the longer they're in power, the less they want to give it up. Power is very addictive. Having seen it firsthand in Number 10, it's incredibly addictive. And when Gordon Brown gave the setting of interest rates at the Bank of England, he did it on day one. And I think the Freedom of Information Act, which I think the Labour government came to sort of rue, was something that they did pretty early on. So I think the reason why these things don't happen is some of them are really quite technical. People don't get their heads around it. And this is why this white paper and this kind of conversation is so important, because we need to get a much bigger sort of push from the public for these sorts of changes. I mean, I think in a way, the last election was a really good election because the issue of trust was right at the heart. But some of the sort of underpinnings of trust, like these obscure regulation-making powers, are not widely understood at all. And I think that, understanding the importance of an independent ethics and integrity commission, that's a detail. But if we can build more support for these things, they're more likely to happen. And I think given what happened under the last government and may happen under this government too, I think they are better in that respect in terms of integrity. But, we'll have to see, won't we? It's important to build that public support for these changes.
So can I, whilst I've got you, Caroline, pick up Vicky Price's comment, which she asks, is it fair for politicians? Starmer did it himself today, she says, to blame civil servants, as Gove and Rees-Mogg and Maud have done before. And if you make the trust deficit also cover civil servants, then sure, we've lost. Are you concerned, given the comment you make about, politicians need to do this stuff very, very early, that we are already too late and we're beginning to see behaviours that look like the last government?
Keir Starmer promised a reset in politics. He promised to end the culture wars. He gave a very positive statement to the civil service almost on day one about wanting to work with them. And I thought today's speech was a massive step backwards, actually. The sort of whole analogy of the targets being like some sort of iron gauntlet, throwing down on their desks and, essentially portraying them as blockers is starting in the direction which we saw under the last government of calling civil servants the blob. And, I think that does erode, starts to erode trust in government, which the Labour Party is leading in government. I think it's very damaging to the institutions, and it's not in the white paper because Tom's pretty much focusing on sort of Parliament and ministers and so forth. But I think that one of the things that happened under the last government was a disrespect towards the democratic institutions, whether it's civil service, the BBC, charities campaigning, blaming the blockers, which is now one of Starmer's words. I think is incredibly detrimental to the whole health of democracy. And I think they have to take responsibility. I mean, for goodness sake, they've only just started government to start laying into the civil service as, stopping them from doing things. It's a bad step, and I find it very depressing that he said that today.
I'm really struck by Michael Shaw's question, because it's very easy to beat ourselves up about all of this stuff. And Michael said also, I think quite openly, to what extent is the lack of trust, dishonesty, disengagement better or worse in the UK when compared to similar democracies? Is this a UK problem, a global problem, or actually not really a changed problem overall? Tom, do you want to have a first stab at that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just on the previous point with civil servants, my experience as a minister was if you gave the civil servants clear guidance on what it was you were wanting to do, how much you were willing to pay for it, and what political damage you were willing to take to implement it if it was unpopular, that they would go ahead and do the job and give you options. So my experience is not the same as it would appear to be Keir Starmer's. And having given that forthright defence of civil servants, I've now forgotten what your question was, Ben, so you better tell me again.
Better or worse in Britain? Are we seeing something particularly British here, or is this a global problem?
It appears to be a global problem, but we do have sort of peaks of damage that have been caused to the body politic in the UK around certain incidents. The most memorable being, of course, the expenses scandal, which in 2009 really damaged politicians generally in a way that I think probably people haven't quite yet recovered from. And then there have been other waves of similar events. I mean, the government, for instance, suffered from Freebiegate. So yes, I think it's something that affects all Western democracies, but we do ourselves additional damage by not trying to preempt some of the very large banana skins that successive parliaments or governments have slipped up on in the last 20 years or so.
Paul, would you agree?
Yes, I do. I think there's one element which is certainly universal, which we haven't touched on, and that is the move from the conventional media to the social media. Just to take an example.
Scott picks up this point.
Sorry?
Tricia Scott is picking up this point.
Well, I hope I'm going to respond in advance as to what the point she's made. I mean, just for an example, it isn't a very new one. I mean, on the last few days before the 2016 European referendum, much more money was spent on the social media by outsiders, both foreign and outside our political system, not the campaigners who were official, not the parties, than were by those that were actually registered and known about. So, and of course, they disappeared immediately after the result. And that is a new factor. but it's affecting every single democracy, every sort of government all around the world now, that there is undercover a huge amount of paid for activity, and of course, relatively cheaply paid activity, which is, I think, totally universal. And I don't really know. I'm no expert. All I know is that we should try and find out more about it and see what can be done to make it transparent.
So Bob Gillespie is asking a question which I want to use to ask my own question, which is a bit mean of me. So Bob says, isn't it time to consider ending the system whereby all of those participating in decisions affecting our lives must be elected, must be members of a political party, and must be endorsed by a political party? If democracy means people power, and if communication is far easier in the age of electronic messaging, surely we need far more involvement of us, the people. And I'm struck by, actually the fact that we've got more independents at the beginning of this parliament, so people are not backed by political parties, than we have had for a long time. So I'm interested in whether you think that, whether it's on purpose or not, we might see a further breakdown of a party-based democratic system, and whether that would be good or bad. I don't know, Caroline, if you want to come in on that.
Well, can I just sort of say something on the last question about are we worse than other countries? Because there are some international indices. It's quite hard to answer the question, but there are Civicus, for example, monitors across the whole world the health of civic freedoms, including things like the right to protest, the use of extremism laws, and those sorts of things, and attitudes towards charities and civil society. And it has downgraded the UK to the same level now as Hungary, which, as many of you will know, is quite a repressive regime. And Danny Shrishkandaraja, who's now at the New Economics Foundation, but used to run Civicus, has said to me that, he's very worried that we are complacent in the UK about our civic health. That we think because, mother of all parliaments, etc., that really, just maybe a few issues here and there, but really we're just the same as everybody else. But what, they're looking at cold, hard data, and there has been a decline. And we're now in the obstructed category. And if you see a map of Europe, you'll see that there are very few in that category in Western Europe, but we are the one. So, no scope for complacency there. I mean, should we be bringing in more people to make decisions through different routes? I think the government and Parliament should be opening itself up to, to listening to different voices more. For example, from civil society, charities, and others in the voluntary sector and social enterprises. I think that citizens' assemblies are an incredibly useful way of thinking, and I think that participatory budgeting, which can often be used locally very effectively, to make decisions about how money should be spent. It's another example of how you can bring people into the decision-making process. I don't think everybody wants to do everything, but there are certain things where it really, getting in those wider voices can really enrich democracy and rebuild trust with the people, people on the ground, many of whom are not voting at the moment, as others have said.
Tom, did you want to come in on that point?
Yes, just briefly. So first of all, there are things that the government can and should do to engage people more in these processes, and some of them have been referred to. So reverting back to a green paper, white paper, draft bill process, so there are lots of points of engagement for the public. Certainly, citizens' assemblies have an important role to play. Maybe, for instance, advising the Commons and the Lords in terms of looking at some of the more controversial issues like social care, for instance, and feeding into the legislative process. And finally, on the question of devolution, that is very definitely a way of engaging the public, but you have to do it in a way that actually gives real power to local authorities and neighbourhoods and regions, and that involves handing over power. And it involves also handing over fundraising powers for them to then make their own decisions, and occasionally make their own mistakes. We have a really strange situation in this country where every now and again, one of the ministers in the relevant department decides that he or she is going to be the person who is going to determine how often the rubbish is collected. Well, that is a local authority responsibility, not something that ministers should be losing sleep over.
So thanks, Tom. And I mean, much to my sort of amazement, horror, we're almost out of time. Hour has absolutely flown. So I want to just come back to you each and ask you for one thing that you think is politically deliverable. And I want you to be really specific, but something politically deliverable in this area. So, Paul, you said, money was your absolute top priority. Have you got a political ask that you actually think we might be able to make progress on?
Yes, very simply, I think we should make sure that the decision of the Supreme Court in 2018 that the candidate standing in a constituency and his or her agent should be wholly responsible for money spent in getting them elected should be endorsed and enacted rather than the rather wishy-washy stuff we've now got under the Elections Act of 22, when a political party or an individual can pour money into that constituency and the candidate and his agent or her agent can pretend it's nothing to do with them. I want some transparency and accountability at the constituency level. Tom and I, if we'd ever allowed that to happen in our day as candidates, would be in front of an election court and possibly lose our seats.
And you believe you can make that politically deliverable because, in one sentence?
Because I think MPs otherwise are going to find they're going to be so beholden to the people who've paid that money in that they'll be just lobby fodder for the government of the day or for the party that's pushing them around.
Great. So, Caroline, one political change that you think is politically deliverable, given all the obstacles we've just
very
identified?
quickly, the new Ethics and Integrity Commission, independently led. The government's promised to do it. We need to hold its feet to the fire, but it should happen, and then it can get into the business of trying to sort out and make much stronger the controls, the regulations on standards.
Thank you. That's very nice and specific. And yeah, being in the manifesto, one would hope that it should be deliverable. What about you, Tom?
Well, I'm going to offer two. I'm going to cheat. So, first of all, require political parties to check whether any donations they receive are from a legal source, so anti-money laundering checks, and from a domestic source, in other words, not from abroad. But more easy to achieve perhaps than that would be for the government to restore the independence of the Electoral Commission, which would require the government to delete probably a single clause from the Elections Act and stop the government determining what the strategy and policy for the Electoral Commission is.
And you think that will be politically desirable to this government because?
I think that is eminently achievable. It could be done with a very simple private members bill that the government could hand to a sympathetic backbencher, and the government are on record having slammed the previous government for doing this. So they would just be delivering, I think, on a promise that was made before the general election.
Fantastic. Look, thank you so much to all of our speakers, both for providing lots of thought and lots of things that we could and should be changed, but also actually for that specificity at the end, which I really appreciate about what we actually may be able to get through. I think in this area, given all the obstacles we've identified, being realistic about what's achievable is really very valuable to us. I'm afraid we're out of time. Can I just say, firstly, huge thank you to all three of our speakers. You've made the time fly by. It's been great. Can I also say huge thank you to all of those who've joined the conversation? Very large number of you. I particularly like the question, the first question from Tricia Scott, saying that this is a great meeting and aren't there more of them? So for her, the answer is yes. And for anyone else who's interested, we now have a Christmas break, but our next session is on the 28th of January with Paul Morland, who is one of the country's leading demographers and broadcasters, and has just written a book called No One Left, which should, I think, grab all of our attentions and will make for a very interesting discussion. So thank you to everyone. If you've enjoyed yourself, as I always say at the end of these, if you would otherwise have been going to the cinema and spent a tenner on that, I hope we've entertained you far more than Gladiator 2. And so if you felt able to spend what you would have spent on that ticket on a contribution for us to be able to do more of these types of events and continue this conversation and hopefully the campaigning action, go to the Radix website. You'll see how to donate there, and we very much appreciate that. Meanwhile, I wish everybody a very good seasonal greetings. Have a good break and come back in the new year refreshed and ready to take on the government on all of these issues. Thank you again. By all means, restart your cameras if you want to wave and say goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Ben.
Tom.
Bye.
Thank you, Caroline.
Very
Paul.
good.
Great
Bye.
session.